There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday afternoon or a casual request from a friend. They wear the camouflage of the mundane, and only in retrospect, when you trace the timeline of your heart back to its point of fracture and reformation, do you see that ordinary moment for what it was, the beginning of everything. For me, it was a sentence, spoken so lightly it was almost carried away by the clink of champagne flutes and the dull hum of polite conversation. It was a sentence that hung in the air between us, shimmering with a possibility I had long since taught myself to ignore, a door I had bolted from my side, and convinced myself I had lost the key for. Julian, my best friend, leaned in so close I could smell the gin and tonic on his breath, a clean, sharp scent like winter air, and the warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the cavernous, overchilled ballroom we were standing in. His eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, were scanning the room with a familiar, restless energy, a kind of frantic boredom that always set in when he was forced into these corporate schmooze fests. He hated them. He was a creature of genuine connection or comfortable solitude, and this noisy, glittering in-between was his personal purgatory. He turned that gaze on me, and for a second, the frantic energy softened into something else, something I couldn't quite name but felt in the base of my spine like a low, resonant frequency. His tie, a silk affair in a shade of blue that was too bright for his muted personality, was slightly askew. I had the absurd, overwhelming urge to reach out and straighten it, to let my fingers linger for a half-second too long on the knot at his throat. I had spent years cataloging and suppressing urges just like that one, filing them away in a mental cabinet labeled "Do Not Touch," fragile friendship inside. But then he spoke, and the words he chose were not ones I had ever prepared for. They were not in any of my carefully curated disaster preparedness drills for my own heart. "God, I hate this," he murmured, his voice a low countermelody to the string quartet butchering some pop song in the corner. "Everyone wants to talk about quarterly projections and synergy. I feel like a wind-up toy." He took a sip of his drink, his gaze flicking over my shoulder to where his boss was holding court. "I need a shield, an excuse not to talk to anyone." I had been his shield on countless occasions, the quiet, unassuming friend who could be stood next to without demanding conversation, a comfortable silence in a loud room. I was preparing to deploy my usual tactics, to find us a quiet corner, or invent a reason we needed to step outside for some air. I was his photographer friend, his plus one, the guy who was always observing, never participating, a role I had long ago accepted. But he did not wait for my suggestion. He looked directly at me, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face, a smile that was 90% mischief and 10% something I was too afraid to decipher. "Hey," he said, the words soft but charged. "Let's pretend we're dating for the night." And there it was, the ordinary moment, the sentence that recalibrated the world. It was a joke, of course, a means to an end, a social strategy deployed by a man who treated human interaction like a complex bit of code to be hacked. But for me, the words landed with the weight of a prophecy. He said it to build a wall between himself and the room, but all I could feel was the sudden, terrifying demolition of the wall I had so carefully constructed between the two of us. He wanted to pretend. The tragedy, the one I had to hide behind a practiced, easygoing smile, was that for me, no pretending would be necessary at all. The act he was proposing was simply the life I had been living in the quiet, unlit rooms of my own mind for the better part of a decade. He put his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that was both a performance for the room and an anchor for himself, and I felt the warmth of his palm not as a simple touch, but as a brand, a seal, a point of no return. We had met in the way that so many life-altering connections are forged, through the shared, quiet desperation of a university library after midnight. I was a photography student, lost in the chemical-scented darkness of the campus darkroom most nights, but occasionally forced into the fluorescent glare of the 24-hour study hall to write an essay on photographic theory that I had, inevitably, left to the last minute. He was a computer science major, a prodigy of logic and code, who seemed to subsist entirely on lukewarm coffee from a vending machine and the sheer, stubborn force of his own intellect. I remember seeing him for weeks before we ever spoke. He was a study in controlled chaos, with a storm of dark, unruly hair that he was constantly trying to tame with his hands, and a way of staring at his laptop screen as if he could bend the code to his will through sheer intensity. He would sit for hours, surrounded by a fortress of textbooks, his focus so absolute that the rest of the world seemed to fall away. I was the opposite. I was a creature of observation. My world was made of light and shadow, of stolen glances and the subtle shifts in posture that betrayed a person's inner state. I was quiet not out of shyness, but because I was always listening, always watching, composing the world into frames. He was a puzzle of frantic, kinetic energy, and I was a still, patient watcher. It seemed impossible that our orbits would ever intersect. But one night, or rather, one early morning when the sky was beginning to pale from black to a bruised purple, his laptop died. I heard the soft, mournful chime and then a deep, frustrated sigh that seemed to carry all the weight of his exhaustion. He dropped his head into his hands, and in that moment, the fortress of his concentration crumbled. He just looked lost, small. I had a spare charger in my bag. It was a simple thing, a common courtesy, but offering it felt like crossing a boundary I had only ever observed from a distance. "Need a lifeline?" I asked, my voice sounding rough in the profound silence of the library. He looked up, and his eyes, which I had only ever seen narrowed in focus, were wide and surprisingly gentle. They were green, a deep, complicated green that reminded me of the moss that grew on the north side of old trees. He gave me a tired, grateful smile that completely transformed his face, erasing the lines of stress around his mouth. That was the beginning. We talked for an hour that morning, while his machine charged, about everything and nothing. About the elegant logic of a well-written program and the accidental magic of a photograph developed with a flawed chemical mixture. We discovered a shared love for old science fiction films, for rainy days, for the specific kind of quiet that only falls after 3 a.m. It was an easy, immediate connection, a feeling of finding a missing piece of your own language in another person's vocabulary. Our friendship became a central pillar in the architecture of my life. Julian was the magnetic force, the one who pulled me out of my shell, who insisted I come to parties where I would spend the entire night in a corner, just watching, but feeling, for the first time, like I belonged there with him. I, in turn, was his anchor. I was the one he called when the code wouldn't compile, when the pressure of his own ambition became too much, when he just needed to sit in a room with someone and not have to perform. I learned to read the subtle weather patterns of his moods, the tight set of his jaw that meant a project was going badly, the restless tapping of his fingers that signaled an oncoming wave of anxiety, the rare, unguarded laughter that meant he felt truly, completely at ease. I photographed him, of course, not for any project, but for myself. I have a box of prints, hidden away, that chronicles our friendship. Julian laughing in the autumn light of a park. Julian asleep on my couch, his face peaceful and young. Julian staring out my window at the rain, lost in a thought he would never share. These were not just images, they were acts of devotion. The love I felt for him grew so slowly, so organically, that I barely noticed it happening until it was simply there, a fundamental part of my internal landscape, like a mountain range that had risen from the earth while I was busy looking at the sky. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic passion. It was a quiet, steady ache, a constant, low-level awareness of him in the world. It was the way my stomach would dip when he called, the way I would unconsciously map his location when he was traveling for work, tracking him across time zones as if my attention were a gravitational pull that could keep him safe. He dated, of course, a series of bright, confident women who seemed, to my observant eye, to be attracted to the brilliant, successful version of Julian he presented to the world. They loved the charming consultant, the man who could command a boardroom. But I never felt they saw the Julian I knew, the one who got lost in his own head, the one who was secretly terrified of not living up to the expectations he set for himself. I watched these relationships rise and fall like tides, and with each one, I would brace myself, reinforcing the walls of our friendship, terrified that this would be the one that would change things, the one that would make him need my quiet presence less. And through it all, I kept my secret. I buried it deep, under layers of casual banter and easy camaraderie. To tell him, I reasoned, would be an act of profound selfishness. It would be like taking a photograph and demanding the subject love the image back. Our friendship was a delicate, perfectly balanced ecosystem, and my feelings were an invasive species that could destroy it all. So I became a master of compartmentalization. There was the friendship, a thing of light and air and shared history. And there was the love, a thing I kept in a locked, lightless room inside myself. I learned to live with the door between them, to never, ever let it creak open. The irony was that I, the quiet observer, the one who prided himself on seeing the truth of things, was living the most profound lie of all. I was his best friend, his anchor, his port in a storm. And I was hopelessly, silently, and completely in love with him. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion. It began after Clara. Clara had been the most serious of his girlfriends, a sharp, ambitious lawyer with a smile that was as bright and cutting as a shard of glass. They had been together for 2 years, and from my vantage point, their relationship had seemed less like a partnership and more like a merger. They looked good on paper. Their lives ran on parallel tracks of ambition and success. I think, for a while, Julian had convinced himself that this was what love was supposed to be, a logical, well-executed plan. But I would watch him when he was with her, and the frantic, restless energy was always there, just beneath the surface. He was performing the role of the devoted boyfriend, and while he was a consummate actor, I could see the strain. The breakup was, in his words, a mutually agreed-upon dissolution of assets. It was clean, efficient, and utterly devoid of the messy, human emotion I would have expected. He announced it to me over a beer, his tone so matter-of-fact that it was more chilling than any outburst would have been. He spoke of it like a failed project, a venture that had not yielded the expected returns. He didn't seem heartbroken. He just seemed empty, as if the performance had finally ended and he had forgotten who he was when the curtain came down. That was the catalyst. The emptiness he felt began to act like a vacuum, and he started to pull my presence into it to fill the void. It started subtly. He would call more often, not to talk about anything specific, but just to hear a voice. He would be on a business trip in some sterile hotel room in Chicago or Singapore, and my phone would ring at an absurd hour. "Hey," he'd say, his voice thick with sleep and loneliness. "What are you up to?" And I would lie there in the dark of my own apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I would talk to him about the book I was reading or a new printing technique I was trying, my voice a low, steady thread spooling out across continents and oceans to find him in his anonymous room. I became his human white noise machine, a calming frequency to tune into when the silence of his own life became too loud. Then he started showing up. He lived in a sleek, minimalist condo across town, a place that always felt more like a showroom than a home, all polished concrete and glass. It was a space designed for the successful version of Julian, not the lost one. My apartment, by contrast, was a comfortable chaos of books, camera equipment, and prints in various stages of development. It smelled of darkroom chemicals, old paper, and brewing coffee. It was a space that was lived in, a space that was mine. And it became his refuge. He would appear at my door late at night. After a grueling week of travel, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his expensive suit looking like a costume he couldn't wait to shed. "Just needed to decompress somewhere that doesn't echo," he'd say, offering a weak smile as he bypassed the living room and collapsed onto my worn-out sofa. He wouldn't want to talk. He would just lie there, his eyes closed, while I moved around the apartment, making tea, tidying up my contact sheets, the quiet domestic sounds of my life seeming to soothe him. I would watch him, the harsh lines of the consultant softening in the warm, low light of my living room, and a dangerous, foolish hope would begin to germinate in the dark soil of my heart. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his sanctuary. The lines were blurring, the carefully drawn boundaries of our relationship beginning to dissolve like chalk in the rain. He wasn't seeking advice or entertainment. He was seeking comfort, a specific kind of comfort that, for reasons he could not articulate and I was too afraid to assume, only I could provide. The architecture of our friendship was being renovated, room by room, and I had no idea what the final floor plan was going to look like. All I knew was that he kept knocking on my door, and I kept letting him in. The ritual began on a cold Tuesday in November, the kind of night where the wind howled with a desolate, mournful sound and the rain didn't so much fall as it threw itself against the windows. Julian had been in my apartment since 7, sprawled on the couch, wrapped in a quilt my grandmother had made, staring blankly at a documentary about deep-sea life that I had put on. He had just come back from a 2-week trip to London where a major deal had fallen through at the last minute. He was hollowed out, worn down to a nub by the relentless friction of his job. Around 11, I noticed his breathing had deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I watched him for a long time, the blue light of the television flickering over his face, making his features look like a landscape of hills and valleys. The urge to reach out and brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead was a physical ache in my hand. I let him sleep. I turned off the television, leaving only a small lamp on, and went into my bedroom. But I couldn't sleep. I was too aware of him, just one thin wall away. It felt like having a live electrical current running through my home. The air itself was charged with his presence. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a soft shuffling sound. I held my breath. The sound was followed by a quiet knock on my bedroom door, so tentative it was barely audible. "Leo." His voice was a hoarse whisper. "You awake?" My heart did a slow, painful somersault. "Yeah, everything okay." The door creaked open a few inches. He was silhouetted in the dim light from the living room, a tall, uncertain shape. "Sorry, my apartment feels a million miles away, and the couch is, I don't know, cold." He paused, and in that silence, I felt the weight of his unspoken need. "Mind if I just crash on your floor? It's stupid, I know. I really don't want to be alone right now." It was the first time he had ever admitted it so plainly. Not couched in excuses about convenience or decompression, but a raw, simple admission of loneliness. And it shattered my defenses. To have him sleep on the floor like a stray felt impossibly cruel. The space in my queen-sized bed suddenly felt vast and empty. "Don't be an idiot, Julian," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The floor is freezing. Just get in." I shifted over to one side, creating an expanse of empty mattress between us. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then slipped into the room, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was deafening in the quiet. He moved to the far side of the bed and slid under the covers, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. We lay there in the dark, 2 separate entities on a single island, the space between us a chasm of unspoken questions. The air was thick with the scent of him, that clean, rain and ozone smell, now mingled with the familiar scent of my laundry detergent. It was intoxicating and terrifying. I lay perfectly still, my body rigid, listening to the sound of his breathing, trying to match my own to its rhythm. That night established the new precedent. It became our unspoken routine. A few nights a week, he would end up at my place. We would put on a movie, a pretense that we both silently agreed to. We would start on the couch, but eventually, he would follow me to my bedroom. The first few times, we maintained the careful, rigid distance, a no-man's land of sheet and blanket between us. But slowly, imperceptibly, the space began to shrink. It started with an accidental touch, his foot brushing against mine, a jolt of electricity that made me freeze. He didn't pull away. Then, one night, deep into a film we weren't watching, I felt a weight on my shoulder. He had fallen asleep, his head slumping against me. I sat there for over an hour, my muscles screaming in protest, my entire being focused on the warm, heavy pressure of his head, the soft puff of his breath against my neck. The ritual evolved. The pretense of the movie became thinner and thinner. He would arrive, already looking exhausted, and simply say, "Can we just lie down?" We would climb into bed, fully clothed, and he would turn on his side, away from me. But after a few minutes of silence, I would feel him shift, turning back, moving closer. He started leaving a bag of his things at my apartment, a toothbrush, a change of clothes, a specific brand of tea he liked. My home, my sanctuary, was becoming ours. The door to my bedroom, which I had always kept closed, was now perpetually left ajar on the nights I knew he might come over, a silent invitation. It was a liminal space we had created, a bubble that existed outside the normal rules of our friendship, outside the normal rules of the world. Inside this bubble, touch became our primary language. One night, he was particularly restless, his leg twitching with a nervous energy that even exhaustion couldn't quell. On an impulse that felt both reckless and deeply necessary, I reached out and laid my hand on his arm. He went still. I could feel the tense muscle under his shirt begin to relax under the gentle pressure of my palm. After a moment, he let out a long, slow breath and didn't move. My hand stayed there all night. From then on, touch was permitted. A hand on an arm, my fingers tracing patterns on his back when he couldn't sleep. His arm eventually finding its way around my waist, pulling me closer until my back was flush against his chest, his chin resting on the top of my head. I lived a strange, bifurcated existence. During the day, I was Leo, the photographer, Julian's best friend. We would talk on the phone, grab lunch, and everything would be normal, easy, platonic. We never spoke of the nights. We never acknowledged the fact that we were, for all intents and purposes, sharing a bed, sharing a life. But as evening fell, a quiet tension would begin to build in me, a yearning that was almost painful. I would find myself watching the clock, waiting for the text that would say, "On my way," and when he arrived, we would step back into our bubble, back into the silent, intimate world we had built. I was developing these moments in the darkroom of my mind, poring over every detail. The weight of his head on my chest, the way his fingers would sometimes tighten their grip on my shirt in his sleep, the sound of his heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic drum against my back. I was searching for the truth in these images, trying to understand what they meant. Was this just about comfort for him? Was I just a convenient, warm body, a human tranquilizer? Or was this something more? Was he, in his own unconscious, fumbling way, feeling what I was feeling? The hope was a constant, dangerous flame inside me, and the fear that I was misinterpreting everything was the cold wind that threatened, at every moment, to extinguish it. The night of the gala, the night he proposed his pretend relationship, felt like the culmination of this entire secret, silent evolution. When he put his hand on my back, it wasn't the first time he had touched me with an easy, possessive intimacy, but it was the first time he had done it in public for an audience. He was taking the private language of our bubble and speaking it out loud. For the rest of the evening, he played the part of the devoted boyfriend with a startling, unnerving naturalness. He kept his arm around my waist, his thumb rubbing slow, absent circles on my hip. He introduced me to his colleagues not as my friend, Leo, but with a proprietary glance that said, "This is my person. We are a unit." He would lean in to whisper a dry, sarcastic comment in my ear, his lips brushing against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I was both terrified and exhilarated. I felt seen in a way I had never been seen before, and simultaneously felt like the world's biggest imposter. Every beat of my heart was a frantic prayer. Please don't let this end. Please don't let this be just a game. He was building a fantasy around us, a beautiful, fragile structure made of plausible deniability, and I was willingly, desperately living inside it. The most bewildering part was watching him. He seemed more relaxed, more himself, than I had ever seen him at one of these events. The shield wasn't just a wall against others. It seemed to be a permission slip for himself. A permission to be attentive, to be tender, to touch. It was as if by labeling the behavior as pretend, he had finally given himself the freedom to act on an impulse that had been there all along. He was playing a role, but the emotions he was channeling felt frighteningly, breathtakingly real. As the night wound down and we finally escaped into the cool, quiet dark of the city street, he didn't remove his hand from my back. He kept it there as we walked to the car, a silent, steady pressure that said the game wasn't over yet. He was supposed to be pretending, but as he looked at me under the hazy glow of a streetlight, his eyes soft and unguarded, I had the dizzying, terrifying thought that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to forget his lines. The ritual had become so ingrained in the fabric of our lives that the nights Julian wasn't there felt like a profound and jarring absence. The bed felt too big, the silence in my apartment too complete. I had grown accustomed to the weight of him beside me, the sound of his breathing in the dark. It was a dangerous dependency, a quiet addiction I was doing nothing to fight. On the nights he was there, the air was thick with a tension that had shifted from anxious to expectant. The imaginary line down the middle of the mattress had long since been erased. We slept tangled together, a comfortable, unthinking knot of limbs. His arm was a permanent fixture around my waist, my head a permanent fixture on his chest. It was the most profound intimacy I had ever known, and it was all built on a foundation of unspoken, unacknowledged feelings. It was a house of cards, and I was terrified that a single word, a single breath, would bring it all tumbling down. The breaking point came, as they so often do, on an utterly unremarkable evening. A Thursday. It was raining again, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the city lights outside my window into a watercolor wash. We were in bed, the glow of his laptop casting long shadows across the room as he half-heartedly answered a few late emails. I was reading, but the words on the page were a meaningless jumble. My entire awareness was focused on the sliver of space between our bodies, on the warmth radiating from his skin. The movie pretense had been abandoned for weeks. There was no longer any need for an excuse. This was just what we did now. He finished his work and closed the laptop, plunging the room into a near-total darkness, relieved only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and rolled onto his side to face me. For a long time, we just lay there, looking at each other in the dim light. I could see the faint outline of his face, the dark sweep of his lashes, the curve of his mouth. The silence wasn't empty. It was humming with everything we had never said. It was a physical presence in the room, a weighted blanket pressing down on both of us. My heart was hammering, a frantic, wild bird trapped in my ribs. I felt like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, and the slightest movement could send us over. Then he moved. He lifted his hand, slowly, tentatively, as if he were afraid of startling me. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a shock-wave through my entire system. It was different from all the other touches, all the casual, sleepy moments of closeness. This was deliberate. This was a question. His eyes, deep, dark pools in the shadows, searched mine. I could see the vulnerability in them, the uncertainty, the fear. It was the same look he'd had in the library all those years ago, the look of someone small and lost and utterly open. My own fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but the hope, that stubborn, foolish hope, was a fire that burned it away. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull back. I held his gaze, and in that shared look, I tried to pour all the years of silent affection, all the quiet devotion, all the patient waiting. I tried to tell him, without words, that it was okay, that he was safe here. He swallowed, a small, audible sound in the quiet room. "Leo," he whispered. His voice was raw, fragile. And then he leaned in. It wasn't a rush of passion. It was the slowest, most hesitant movement I had ever witnessed. It was an act of geological time, a continent drifting a few inches. He was giving me every possible second to stop him, to turn my head, to push him away. He was offering me an escape route, and I had never wanted anything less in my entire life. I met him halfway, closing the final, infinitesimal gap between us. The first touch of his lips was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss, not really. It was a moment of contact. A question mark pressed against my mouth. It was tentative, gentle, and utterly overwhelming. It was the taste of rain and gin from the gala, the scent of my own laundry detergent on his skin, the warmth of his breath. It was a decade of unspoken longing condensed into a single, breathtaking point in time. We stayed like that for a long moment, just a soft pressure, a shared breath, and in that stillness, the entire world seemed to fall away. The house of cards didn't collapse. The ground didn't crumble beneath us. There was only a profound, terrifying, and beautiful silence. Then, with a shuddering breath that felt like it came from the very core of him, he kissed me, really kissed me, and it felt like coming home. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. Not the comfortable, humming quiet of our shared bubble, nor the tense, expectant quiet of the night before. This was a brittle, fragile silence, thin as ice on a winter puddle. I woke up slowly, drifting to the surface of consciousness to the familiar sensation of warmth and weight beside me. For a blissful, hazy moment, everything felt perfect. I was cocooned in the scent of him, his arms still draped over my waist, his leg tangled with mine. The memory of the kiss, of the hours that followed, of soft, whispered confessions and gentle, exploratory touches in the dark, was a warm, glowing ember in my chest. I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost dizzying. The door I had kept locked for so long had been opened, and the person on the other side hadn't run away. He had stepped inside. But when I turned my head, he was awake. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight. The easy, relaxed lines of the man who slept in my bed were gone, replaced by the rigid posture of the consultant who wrestled with intractable problems. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at something 1,000 miles away, and I knew, with a sudden, sickening lurch in my stomach, that he was building a wall. I could almost see the bricks and mortar of it rising between us. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He flinched, as if my voice had been a physical blow. He turned his head, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. They focused somewhere over my shoulder. "Hey," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any of the raw emotion from the night before. I have to go. Early meeting I forgot about." It was a lie. A clumsy, transparent lie. Julian never forgot about meetings. His life was a meticulously color-coded calendar, a fortress of appointments and reminders. Before I could even process what to say, he was untangling himself from the sheets, from me, with a swift, efficient motion. He moved around the room with a frantic, nervous energy, gathering his things, avoiding my gaze. He was a stranger in my bedroom, a ghost who had overstayed his welcome. The intimacy of the night before might as well have been a dream. "Julian, wait," I said, sitting up. "Can we just talk for a second?" "Can't. I'm late," he said, pulling on his shirt. He still wouldn't look at me. He grabbed his keys from the dresser and headed for the door. He paused there, his hand on the knob, his back to me. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to turn around, to say something, anything, that would make sense of this jarring reversal. I'll call you later," he said to the door. And then he was gone. The click of the apartment door closing behind him was like a gunshot in the quiet. I was left alone in the tangled sheets, the scent of him already beginning to fade, the warmth he left behind rapidly turning cold. The ember of peace in my chest had been extinguished, leaving behind nothing but a cold, gray ash. He didn't call. Not later that day, not the next. My texts went unanswered, each one a small, pathetic beacon of hope sent out into a vast, unresponsive void. The silence stretched from hours into days, and with every passing moment, my hurt curdled into a cold, sharp-edged anger, directed as much at myself as at him. I had been a fool. I had mistaken a moment of lonely, confused weakness for something more. I had let myself believe in the fantasy, and now I was left in the wreckage of it. I had risked the most important friendship in my life for a kiss, and I had lost everything. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not something I planned. It was an act of pure, desperate impulse. After 4 days of suffocating silence, of replaying every moment, every touch, every word, and seeing them all warp into evidence of my own delusion, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was a poison, seeping into every corner of my life. I drove to his condo, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, a storm of grief and anger churning inside me. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that the silence had to end, even if it was replaced by the worst possible truth. He opened the door after the third knock, and he looked terrible. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was still in the clothes he had probably worn the day before. The sleek, minimalist apartment behind him was a mess, with takeout containers and discarded clothes littering the surfaces. He looked at me, and his expression was a devastating mix of guilt and fear. "Leo," he breathed, as if the sight of me had knocked the wind out of him. "Don't," I said, my voice tight, holding back a tremor. I walked past him into the apartment, the sterile, empty space feeling like a reflection of the chasm that had opened up between us. I turned to face him. "Don't you dare act surprised to see me. You can't just do that, Julian. You can't kiss me like that, and then just disappear. You don't get to do that." He flinched and ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture of pure distress. "I know. I'm sorry. I've been," he trailed off, unable to finish. "You've been what?" I pressed, my voice rising. I needed him to say it. I needed him to give me the clean cut, the final word, so I could start the long, painful process of healing. "You've been realizing it was a mistake? That you were just confused or lonely? Just say it, Julian. Whatever it is, Just be honest with me for once. I deserve that. After all this, I think I at least deserve the truth. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The sight of it broke through my anger, leaving me feeling raw and exposed. He looked utterly, completely lost. I can't, he whispered, his voice cracking. You can't what? You can't tell me the truth. I can't, because I don't know what the truth is, he said, his voice choked with a desperate frustration. Leo, I don't know what's happening to me. My whole life, I've known the path. I've known the plan. There were steps. There were goals. Everything made sense. And then, you. He gestured vaguely, helplessly. This. Us. Nothing about this fits the plan. And that night, when I kissed you, it was the only thing in my entire life that didn't feel like I was acting. It was the first real thing. And it terrifies me. He finally collapsed onto his ridiculously expensive but uncomfortable-looking sofa, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, ragged sobs. He wasn't a man who cried. I had seen him angry, frustrated, exhausted, but never this. Never this broken. He was a man whose entire identity was built on logic and control, and he had come up against a feeling that defied both. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. All my anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness that was so strong it almost brought me to my knees. This wasn't a rejection. This was a crisis. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't care. He was pushing me away because he cared too much, and it had broken the carefully constructed framework of his world. I crossed the room and sat down on the floor in front of him, my knees almost touching his. I waited for his sobs to subside into shuddering breaths. I didn't touch him. I just waited, giving him the same quiet, steady presence I had always offered. Finally, he lifted his head, his face blotchy and tear-streaked, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. I'm so sorry, Leo, he whispered. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I got so scared. I've never felt anything like that. Not with Clara, not with anyone. It's like I've been living my life in black and white, and you turn the color on. And it's too bright. I don't know how to see it. I reached out then, my hand finding his. His fingers were ice cold. He clung to my hand like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. You don't have to know how, I said softly, my own voice thick with emotion. We can be scared together. We can figure it out. Or not figure it out. We can just be. But you can't run away again, Julian. The silence. I can't do the silence. He looked at our joined hands, then up at my face. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. Okay, he whispered. It was a small word, but it felt like a vow. It was the first brick being laid for a new foundation, one built not on pretense or plausible deniability, but on a terrifying, beautiful, and shared truth. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. It was the end of the pretending and the start of something real. In the days that followed, we began the slow, delicate work of rebuilding. It wasn't a swift or easy process. It was more like tending to a fragile, newly sprouted plant, requiring patience and gentleness and a constant attention to the light. We talked. We talked more than we had in 10 years of friendship, laying our fears and hopes and histories out between us like old photographs. He told me about the immense pressure he had felt his whole life to follow a specific script, the right school, the right career, the right partner, and how my quiet, unassuming presence had always been the only place he could take off the costume. He admitted that the pretend dating idea at the gala hadn't been a random joke. It had been a subconscious, desperate attempt to test the waters, to see what it would feel like to claim me as his in a way that had a built-in escape hatch. I, in turn, confessed the depth and breadth of my own feelings, the decade of silent pining, the careful compartmentalization I had practiced to protect our friendship. I told him about the box of photographs, the secret archive of my devotion. I expected him to be shocked, or perhaps even burdened by the weight of it, but instead, he just listened, his moss-green eyes soft with a dawning understanding. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, so softly I almost didn't hear it. So you've seen me all this time, the real me. And when I nodded, a look of profound relief washed over his face, as if a weight he had been carrying his entire life had finally been set down. He hadn't been terrified of my love. He had been terrified that no one was capable of seeing the person who existed beneath the performance. My quiet observation, which I had always seen as a passive, helpless act, had actually been the one thing that made him feel truly known. We created a new kind of ritual. The nights in my bed continued, but the pretense was gone. There were no more movies we didn't watch, no more unspoken rules about distance. The intimacy was intentional now. We would lie facing each other in the dark and talk for hours, our voices low, our hands clasped together between us. The physical closeness was no longer just about a desperate need for comfort. It was an expression of a choice we were both actively making. It was a conscious act of turning toward each other. The frantic, anxious energy that had always clung to Julian began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, steady calm that I had only ever seen in him when he was asleep. He was learning to be still, to simply exist in a space without needing to perform or achieve. One evening, about a month after his confession, he came over and found me in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an ethereal glow over everything. He had never been in here before. It was my most private space, the place where I translated the world into my own language. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me as I gently agitated a tray of developer, watching an image slowly emerge on the paper. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice hushed, respectful of the sanctuary. "Of course," I said. He came and stood beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. He watched, fascinated, as the ghost of an image sharpened into a clear, crisp photograph. It was a picture I had taken of him weeks ago, asleep on my couch, the afternoon light catching the lines of his face. He looked peaceful, vulnerable, completely unguarded. "That's how you see me?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "It's one of the ways," I replied. "It's the truest one." He reached out, not to touch the photograph, but to take my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His hand was steady and warm. We stood there for a long time in the quiet, red-lit darkness, watching my love for him literally develop before our eyes. It was no longer a secret I had to hide in a box. It was here, out in the open, a tangible thing we could both look at, a truth we had finally learned not to fear. The door to my darkroom, like the door to my bedroom, was no longer a boundary to be cautiously navigated. It was simply an entrance to a room where we could both be. The final piece of the old architecture to be dismantled was the door, not the metaphorical one, but the literal one to my bedroom. For so long, it had been left ajar, an ambiguous signal, a question mark hanging in the hallway. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, moving around each other with the easy, familiar grace of a long-established couple, I went to leave it open out of sheer habit. Julian stopped me, his hand gently closing over mine on the doorknob. He looked at me, a small, soft smile on his face, and he gently pushed the door until it clicked shut, enclosing us in the quiet, intimate space of the room. It was a simple gesture, but it was a definitive statement. There were no more maybes, no more escape routes. We were both on the same side of the door now, and we were choosing to close it together, shutting out the rest of the world. We began to build a life in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create. It was a life made of small, domestic moments. Making coffee for each other in the morning, his code-cluttered laptop on one side of the table and my contact sheets on the other. It was him learning the quiet rhythms of my creative process, and me learning to find the beauty in the elegant logic of his. We were two different languages, but we had finally found a common grammar in tenderness and trust. The pretending was over. The performance had ended. All that was left was the quiet, breathtaking, and very real business of learning to love each other, out in the open, in the full, brilliant, and sometimes overwhelming light of day. And as I lay next to him, his head on my chest, his breathing slow and even, I understood that some moments do not arrive disguised as something ordinary. They arrive as a joke, a game, a pretense. But if you are brave enough, if you are patient enough, they can reveal a truth so profound it remakes your entire world from the inside out. He had asked me to pretend for a night, but in doing so, he had given us a lifetime of something real.